Well, thanks for coming on a Friday night. I know it's raining outside and it's late, so I appreciate you coming. So my goal in this talk is to show how political dogmas undermine the search for truth in universities. I'm going to focus on American universities, but I think a lot of the same trends, I'm going to show the same trends are happening in the UK, in Canada, and in Australia. So the idea here is to highlight how ideological conformity or groupthink in American universities not only undermines research in the universities, but spreads from those universities into society more broadly and around the world via social media, via Google, and all of the technologies that exist in the United States. So there's an old advertising slogan in Las Vegas that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And this is supposed to mean the kind of vices that people go to Vegas to engage in. But this isn't true for universities. What happens on campus definitely doesn't stay on campus. Bad ideas and good ones seep into journalism, they seep into education, politics, and everything else that we care about. So I want to ask at first, what do universities market themselves as doing? Harvard's motto is pretty simple, which is veritas, truth. So Harvard advertises itself as being a factory for interesting new ideas, for true ideas. And I think for the most part, this is true. If we look at chemistry departments, engineering, physics, we're getting a lot of really interesting insights from places like Harvard. But, you know, there's been a trend for at least 5, 10, maybe 15 years on American campuses of radicalization. And I had a guest speaker at a class about 5 years ago at Duke University named Jonathan Haidt, a political psychologist who studies political polarization and tribalism in politics. And what he argued, because he was really concerned about what was going on in American campuses, is that universities should choose one of two goals, truth or social justice. And it's not that those are incompatible, it's that sometimes they can be. If you're choosing a particular ideology over the truth, then that's going to lead to certain results that may be good from the standpoint of your ideology, but may or may not be true. What I'm going to do is make a stronger claim than Jonathan Haidt made, and that is to say that even if universities are committed to the truth and not some other ideology, they still need intellectual diversity, and I think political diversity to achieve that goal. So how diverse are American campuses? Well, we have pretty good data on this. This is from the National Association of Scholars from a few years back, and it gauges the ratio of Democrats to Republicans in a variety of subjects. And you'll notice that no subject in American universities has more Republicans than Democrats. Now, I don't care about Republicans and Democrats per se. This is a kind of useful proxy for political diversity, which is a proxy for intellectual diversity. But notice that at the top, we have engineering, where it's a ratio of something like 2 to 1. Then we get to economics, chemistry, 5 to 1. That's not especially concerning. But then we get down into the humanities and social sciences, and we have ratios of 20 to 1, 50 to 1 even. And I think at that point, we all realize that something has gone wrong here. Maybe it started out in an innocuous way. Maybe, as some political psychologists say, liberals who score high on openness on personality tests, they're more attracted to subjects like world literature, cultural anthropology. That makes perfect sense, right? They're sort of curious, they're worldly, sure. And maybe people who tend to follow order and rules and people who are more interested in making money, they'd go into business and economics, of course they would, right? Maybe they're more likely to be engineers. And so you can see at least a partial explanation for the skew that we have. There are more Republicans in, let's say, engineering or economics than there are in cultural anthropology. But what's happened in the last few years is the trend has accelerated. In fact, this only goes up to 2014. A friend of mine named Phil Magnus has a paper coming out that measures it up to 2020, and what we see is an even bigger divide between, and you see the top line here is far left or liberal, the medium line is moderate, and then the bottom line is far right or conservative. What we now have is data that shows this has been exacerbated even more over the last 5 to 10 years. Okay, and I think the mechanisms here are selection effects and indoctrination effects. So if you take a field like sociology, which started out as just sort of the impartial study of society, how do societies work? Well, they're populated by people, so we need to know a little bit about psychology, a little bit about social psychology, maybe some economics, how maybe game theory, how incentives lead people to act in one way or another. But what we end up with is a situation in which everyone who gets a sociology degree, or nearly everyone, needs to conform to a particular kind of ideology in order to succeed in that field. So we get indoctrination effects and then selection effects. And you ask yourself at this point, given the ratios that I showed you here, who's going to go into anthropology or sociology? Who's going to survive the cultural selection process whereby you're admitted into graduate school, you write papers with a mentor, you do a postdoc, you get a job, you get promoted? Well, it's very unlikely to be nonconformists in a situation like this. And one of the problems here is as we get more conformity ideologically, we get more intolerance. And in fact, according to some surveys done just last year by Eric Kaufman at Birkbeck College in London, we see here a measure of people who are located from the far left to the middle left to the center to the right. And these are students and faculty on campuses. And we see that people further to the right report more hostility toward their views. And this could be in classrooms, in faculty meetings, in hiring decisions or promotion decisions. And what we get then is, as a result of this intolerance, more self-censorship. So again, from Eric Kaufman, take a look at the graph, and you can see the orange line measures people who are more right-wing or conservative. And the gray line is in the center, and once again we see the same pattern, which is to say the further you locate on the right ideologically, the more likely you are to self-censor. We might think, who cares? What's the big deal here, right? I mean, they can still think what they want. Well, maybe not. Actually, according to Kaufman, we now have more and more people confessing out loud that they deliberately censor views they disagree with when they encounter those views, let's say as a journal referee, that are prepared to accept or reject a journal submission, or as somebody who is on a particular committee who's tasked with allocating money in the form of grants. Now, this is kind of scary. We get to a point where, who really cares? I mean, Democrat, Republican, whatever, I don't care who's around me in a classroom. But if that's actually getting at something deeper, which is we have more and more ideological conformity, which is leading to self-censorship, which is leading to actual censorship, that should be alarming no matter what the breakdown is, even if it was reversed, right? And there were many more Republicans to Democrats. I wouldn't care. I would still say the same thing. This is really concerning. Okay, well, why do we care about political diversity? Well, I think it's a good proxy, as I said earlier, for intellectual diversity. Here we have a picture of Keynes and Hayek, two of the great economists of the 20th century. And the smaller caption here is, this has sometimes been called the fight of the century, the Keynes-Hayek debate in macroeconomics. And it has big implications for a lot of different issues. But in a nutshell, as you guys probably know, Keynes famously argued that in an economic downturn, it's really imperative for governments to stimulate demand by spending more, right? So even if they're going to go into debt, we need to stimulate demand. That's going to have some negative consequences, but, we got to get the economy going, so we do that. And then Hayek argued in response, well, sure, that may be true, but if you give governments that kind of power, they might overspend, right? They might spend on useless projects, and that'll create more debt. That will devalue the currency. That creates inflation, and that's exactly where we are now, actually. So, to some extent, both are right, actually, right? So, and the point here is that, of course, we wouldn't get this really subtle worldview unless we had two giants, two intellectual titans, fighting it out over 40 years and then winning the Nobel Prize on different sides of the political aisle. We're all better off because of this. Okay, so that's at least one reason then why we should care about political and therefore intellectual diversity. Namely, we get blind spots when everyone's a member of the same ideology or everyone believes more or less the same thing. The second problem is that political polarization grows when ordinary people whose taxes subsidize university education, when they believe that their children are being taught, or young adults are being taught something that they completely disagree with. Now, I'm not taking a stance on this, on what should be taught and what shouldn't, but you can certainly sympathize with why taxpayers wouldn't want to subsidize a view that they consider abhorrent. So we can just take views like on abortion and sexuality or religion or social welfare programs. Again, this is not about what side you're on these issues. Whatever side you're on, if universities are only teaching one side of these issues, you can understand why taxpayers would be at least a little bit skeptical of what they're doing funding universities. Now, I don't want to talk more about these issues. These are, social war issues, culture war issues. I don't really have strong views on this, but I do have strong views on intellectual freedom. And what I'm going to focus on is how taboos, which emerge when there's too much political conformity, how taboos end up undermining the kind of research that you can do in universities, and they end up warping the kind of worldview that goes from universities out into society more broadly. Why do taboos exist? Well, in general, I think, taboos aren't necessarily bad. Here we have Duke University students on one side and an African tribe on another. Face paint and, chants and songs and slogans, and this is kind of how tribes work, right? We are tribal creatures. There's nothing wrong with the kind of taboos that tribes create, and in fact, taboos serve a function, namely to increase group cohesion and facilitate collective action. We can figure out who's us, who's them, what are our rituals, what kinds of handshakes do we do. This is sort of morally neutral. It can be good or bad depending on how it's used. But what I want to argue is that intellectual taboos can undermine research and the search for truth in universities. So again, this is not an argument against taboos in general. And what I want to do now is explore, where do taboos come from? That is, the kinds of academic taboos that we encounter in America, and I promise you from there to here, to the rest of the world. Well, Gregory Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt wrote an article 5 years ago called The Codelling of the American Mind, a widely read article, and they turned it into a book 2 years later. And what they did is they tried to explore what's going on these campuses, and both of them are actually moderate left wing, right? They're both Democrats, but they noticed a kind of increasing intolerance, especially from the left, over the last, let's say, 10 years on American campuses. They're trying to explore what's going on here. They came up with 3 hypotheses. I think these are part of the truth, but I don't think they go far enough, and I'm going to say why in a minute here. But I'm going to first go through these hypotheses. The first is this idea of safety culture, then emotional reasoning, and victimhood culture. And the idea of safety culture is, well, American teens, like teens in the UK and Canada and Australia, they've grown up in such a safe environment, so free from famine and war and disease, that they demand safe spaces in their universities to protect them not only from people they disagree with, but even from ideas they disagree with, right? So they say, you've probably heard this from the United States, words are violence. Some people actually say that with a straight face, equating mass murder with saying a naughty word. And it's not clear whether they mean this or not, but maybe to some extent they do, according to Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. The second explanation is for these kinds of taboos on American campuses is what they call emotional reasoning. And psychologists actually have a different term for this, and that's motivated reasoning. And the idea is sometimes we want a certain thing to be true, and that leads us to think it's true. Different religious worldviews, political views, etc., can lead us to reason in a way that makes it more likely we'll believe a conclusion independent of the evidence, right? So that's emotional reasoning or motivated reasoning, and obviously it interferes with our ability to evaluate evidence. Here's a recent study from skeptic.com. What they did is they took Americans and they put them along a spectrum of political ideology, once again from far left to moderate left to center to right and far right, and they asked them about the following statement: how many unarmed black men do you think the police killed in the year 2019, which is the year of Black Lives Matter? Okay? And, well, they could choose between about 10, about 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 or more. It's a pretty large number. And what they found is that a really good predictor of their answer is the political ideology that they held. So the further people were to the left, the larger the number that they guessed. What's the actual number? It's about 10, somewhere between 9 and 15, depending on how you estimate it. Large numbers of people, even conservatives, but even larger numbers of people on the far left, thought the answer was 10,000 or more. Think about that. 10 or 10,000 or more. This is so out of touch with empirical reality that it's hard to understand how someone could believe something like this. Well, unless they absorbed a particular narrative, a particular worldview from the media, which more or less comes from universities, right? Remember that journalists are trained up in American universities. This is clearly a case of emotional reasoning. It feels like this must be true, because after all, I watch CNN, and all I see are police beating up black men. So it must be tens of thousands. It can't be 9 or 12 or whatever the number is. Well, there's some truth to this, clearly. The third explanation they give for the taboos on college campuses and the dogmas that those taboos protect is victimhood culture. And the idea here is that in traditional societies, traditional honor cultures, people are judged based on their achievements, and they're expected to outsource judgments about who wins a contest more or less to their friends and their peers. But in a victimhood culture, you're judged based on your perceived victim status, and for the most part, this is according to Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning in this book, Victimhood Culture, you're expected to outsource the punishment to some juridical system, right? The campus authorities and so on. According to what's often been called the progressive stack, if you're disabled, transgendered, and black, then you have more social status or more epistemic credibility than if you're straight, able-bodied, and Asian. Why? Because, well, Asians make the most money in the United States, they get the highest test scores, and so on. So in some sense, there must be something wrong with that. So what we're going to do is invert the values such that victim groups are accorded more social status than perceived merited groups. Wilfred Riley, who's actually a black political scientist in the South, has documented in this book and in a series of papers that hate crimes, that is to say crimes that are motivated by racial animus or animus towards sexual minorities and so on, hate crimes have actually gone down steadily across time in the United States. But hate crime hoaxes have risen dramatically. What do we mean by that? Well, hate crime hoaxes are crimes where actually there was no crime, but you pretend that there was this hate crime. Maybe you draw a swastika on the wall, you report it to the authorities, and you say this is outrageous. You get interviewed in a newspaper. Some of you heard about the Jussie Smollett case in the United States last year. But this is replicated many, many times on college campuses and throughout society. So again, you have actual hate crimes decreasing and hate crime hoaxes increasing. And this, according to Wilfred Riley, maybe is one sign that we live in a kind of victimhood culture instead of an honor culture. In fact, as Riley and others have pointed out, when we look at the objective data, who is committing the hate crimes? Well, it turns out blacks are committing far more hate crimes per capita than any other group in the United States. And not only far more crime, interracial crime, and you can see the statistics here. This is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This is not from CNN. But from the actual Bureau of Justice Statistics, what you see here is the inverse of what most college campuses teach students in America. And from there, of course, again, the journalists promote this worldview. Now, I'm not here to, give you an education in statistics on interracial crime, but rather that's a good example of the third explanation that Haidt and Lukianoff give for these taboos that have emerged on American college campuses. Now, we can see here that when you look at social media, which really rises in the early 2010s, right, around 2012, 2013, Twitter comes about, Facebook is blowing up. What you see is these ideas start spreading from American universities into journalism and into social media, such that we get a dramatic increase in these words like white privilege, people of color, systemic racism, whiteness used as a negative term, marginalized, oppression. Now, again, when you look at the objective data, and you can measure these things, right? Is racism growing or shrinking in the United States over the last 50 years? It's clearly shrinking, and one measure of that, and I can give you many more, is just ask people, how comfortable are you with your children marrying someone of another race or having friends of another race? And the stats go from like 90% uncomfortable to like 90% comfortable over 50 years. So objective racism has clearly dropped dramatically. So has sexism. So has prejudice towards sexual minorities. And we're all happy for that. And yet, if you look at the trends of what's going on in the news media and on college campuses, there's a kind of hysteria. Racism is everywhere. And you may not be able to find a racist, but that's because it's systemic racism. It's implicit racism. Nobody even knows it's there. That's how clever it is. Look, there is some truth to the explanations that Haidt and Lukianoff give, but I think that there's something much deeper going on here. So these worries about microaggressions and safe spaces and calls to be made safe and so on, these I think are consequences, not causes, of the central dogma that exists on American campuses, and from there it's spreading around the world. Yeah, John Haidt is right to say, students, become anti-fragile, Don't stress out so much over poorly worded jokes, Don't be so easily offended. Yeah, that's good advice, but it's also important to really understand what's going on here, and that's what I aim to do right now. So what I call the central dogma is this. It's a term coined by my friend Bo Weingard, and the central dogma is cosmic egalitarianism. The idea being that people can't differ biologically and socially valued traits, and this could be individual differences or group differences. Why? Because these differences would be cosmically unjust. Well, it can be broken down into two assumptions, an empirical one and an ethical one. The ethical assumption is that it's cosmically unfair for abilities to be allocated unequally between individuals or groups. This is why, for example, the SAT exam has been abolished in many American universities in the last year or two. There's really two reasons. One is there are group differences in performance. Asians completely dominate, and other groups score very differently. And we're talking about really big magnitudes here, hundreds of points on average. And then individuals differ dramatically, right? So actually the SAT exam, like IQ tests, they were actually invented to help poor people who might be ready for like an Ivy League education, but they can't afford it, right? But in fact, what's going on now is these tests are being banned, and so these decisions are going to be increasingly arbitrary. Anyway, that's cosmic egalitarianism. The ethical assumption is it's cosmically unfair in some sense for these abilities to be allocated unequally. The empirical assumption is the only explanation is oppression, racism, sexism for explaining these disparities. Okay, so I'm going to give an example of the central dogma, and it comes from a best-selling author in the United States named Ibram Kendi. He talks a lot about racism and oppression and these kinds of things, and he says when you truly believe that racial groups are equal, and this could go for sex or any other groups, then you also believe that racial disparities must be the result of racial discrimination. There can be no other explanation. Okay, well, Bo Weingard and I call this the egalitarian fallacy, and the idea is simply that it incorrectly infers from the existence of disparities that there's some sinister force at work. But in fact, when you look around the world, disparities are the norm, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and it's not necessarily the result of oppression. This term wokeism that's arisen in the last year, the idea, or really a few years, the idea that some people are woke, right? They're spiritually awake, right? It's a kind of new religion. And I would say it's built around the central dogma being that whenever we don't have equity, as they say, right? Exact equality of outcomes, there must be some kind of oppression going on. The goal of wokeism is not equality of opportunity. It's not equality under the law. It's explicitly equity. It's equal outcomes or bust. Okay, well, the problem here is that the central dogma is false, and we've known it's false for a long time. Steven Pinker's book here is 20 years old. Robert Plomin's is 3 years old. But we've known from twin studies in behavioral genetics that intelligence, for example, is 70 to 80% heritable by adulthood. Personality traits are about 50% heritable, and they explain a lot of differences in achievement. Nevertheless, although we have this data, and this has been replicated many thousands of times, not just 5 or 10 times, but there are many, many papers in Nature genetics and behavioral genetics and so on replicating these results. Nevertheless, people like Paige Harden, a geneticist at the University of Texas, she's gotten grief just for highlighting the role of genetics in individual differences. So she has a new book out on this. Larry Summers, past president of Harvard University, was pressured to resign when he discussed sex differences and said, look, at the margins, this is going to lead men and women to choose different occupations, not because they have different abilities, but because they have different preferences that are affected by hormones that become neurotransmitters when they cross the blood-brain barrier. This is well known, it's well studied. Nevertheless, there was outrage. Larry Summers resigns from Harvard. Maybe more controversially, but still at the same university, David Reich, one of the great geneticists alive today, was denounced just a couple years ago for saying, look, there are probably ethnic differences in cognitive traits. We can measure some of them. There are likely to be more. and that it would be surprising if divergent evolution for many tens of thousands of years would produce an exactly equal distribution of traits across all continents in all areas, let alone an equal distribution of cognitive traits. For that, he was denounced. He hasn't been fired yet. He does have tenure, so hopefully he won't be fired. The problem is faith, and I said wokeism is a kind of new religion. Faith doesn't respond to scientific findings. Like other kinds of religions, it creates taboos. How are these taboos enforced? Well, through informal rules and through formal rules. So we can think about the kind of informal rules that exist in a college classroom or on an advisory board, and that is, look, if you say something that's quite different than what most people believe, you're going to be shamed. Now, in some cases, shame is a really useful emotion, right? I mean, some people should be shamed, right? But, if you're just sort of a dissenter and you honestly believe that the data supports an alternative hypothesis, you probably shouldn't be shamed. That's probably not the best way to get at the truth. That's informal rules. Formal rules are examples like diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies, which are increasingly found on college campuses in America. And from there, they've made their way into corporate boards, so Nike and Facebook and Netflix, and from there, they've made it to the rest of the world. Now, in principle, it's not like I'm against diversity. I mean, this lecture is actually about the value of intellectual diversity and the problems with having too little of it. But of course, what they're after here is racial and sexual diversity, and that often means a very, very specific kind of thing, which I'll get to. So according to a recent Wall Street Journal article, and that's on the right-hand side here, the caption here, DEI with the turtle sticking his head out, it's from the Wall Street Journal article called How Diversity Turned Tyrannical. It came out a few weeks ago. And according to this article, the Life Sciences Department at Berkeley reports that 76% of all applicants in 2019 were rejected based on their diversity statements before their academic research was even looked at. I was a student at Berkeley 20 years ago. It's always been very left-leaning, but there was nothing like this going on even 20 years ago. When I was there, I remember I worked at the faculty club as a waiter and a bartender, and we had all these parking spots for patrons, and there were like 20 or 30 set aside for the current Nobel laureates at Berkeley. They were all in like chemistry and physics and all these areas. #1 math, department in the world. And I want you to think about that. Now, 20 years later, 76% of all applicants to the life sciences were rejected before even looking at their research. They were rejected based on their diversity score. Are you yourself a racial minority, or can you show that you've engaged in some kind of social justice act that we approve of in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office? Okay, well, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices not only employ kind of armies of bureaucrats looking for racism, because the demand for racism exceeds the supply, as we said with the hate crime hoaxes being on the rise. Often they look for hate crimes and racist incidents, and even when it's really dicey, there isn't good evidence for a particular incident, they'll get armies of these bureaucrats, they take the side of the person who claims to be a victim, and instead of going through a proper legal proceeding in a court of law, they'll prosecute them on campus, they'll harass them, there will be student newspaper stories, and they're gone. This is what diversity, equity, and inclusion offices are actually doing on American campuses, as good as their name actually sounds, right? Diversity, who could be against that, right? Well, they also have another function, which is to fire free thinkers. So a couple of years ago, a guy named Noah Carl was fired from the University of Cambridge after he was investigated for, as they said, morally questionable research. They did not say, nobody alleged in this case that it was scientifically invalid, but it was morally questionable because it involved topics like diversity and crime and immigration and so on. These are topics where you can address them, but only if you come to the right conclusion. He came to the wrong conclusion. He was investigated at Cambridge University and fired. My friend Bo Weingard was investigated and then fired actually for a paper we co-wrote defending the view that Darwinian evolution best explains some cognitive differences in performance. Just a few weeks ago, Kathleen Stock was bullied into resigning from her position in the United Kingdom for questioning transgender orthodoxies. She's actually a very far left-wing feminist, and as such, she thinks there are differences between men and women and that we shouldn't cloud those differences, even though she respects transgendered people. For saying that, for saying sex is real and there are such differences, she was harassed and bullied into resigning. Another friend of mine, Nathan Kaufness, a graduate student at Oxford, now he's finished his PhD last year, ran into similar difficulties when he published a mildly controversial paper, and a group of academic philosophers with tenure pressured the editor-in-chief of the journal to resign. So think about this. Academic philosophers, they actually defended the view that censorship is better than debate. The paper that he wrote passed peer review. They had an opportunity to respond to that paper in print. They could easily do that. They had the politically correct position. Everyone would have published that position. Instead, they bullied the editor-in-chief into resigning, and they claimed victory. In response, Nathan said, academic philosophers like to trace their lineage to Socrates, but their true lineage comes from the Athenians who killed Socrates. So public denunciations and firings like this, they really have at least two functions or two results, and both of them are bad. One is a kind of chilling effect on knowledge production. They signal to students and faculty that there are certain topics that are off limits, or if the topic is not off limits, there are only certain conclusions you can come to. Moreover, these kinds of denunciations create what psychologists call pluralistic ignorance. And the idea is, if you don't know what everyone else believes, even if everyone agrees with you, but you don't know that they agree with you, and there's some stigma attached to saying the thing that everyone actually agrees with, then you're less likely to say it, and you're more likely to think, maybe I'm kind of crazy for thinking this thing. And in a way, that's the point of censorship, right? I think that people who advocate censorship kind of understand that's the effect of it, and that's why they do it. They know that probably there's something to what the other side believes, so we need to gaslight them into thinking they're actually crazy. There's no evidence whatsoever for any of this stuff. Okay, so what I want to do is end by pointing out a couple of consequences, one of which is inside the academy, the other of which is outside the academy, the kind of consequences of conformity, and then I want to ask what we can do, if anything. So, in his famous book, On Liberty, which everyone should read, John Stuart Mill argued, well, this is really a summary of his argument, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. And the idea is, like, to get a true belief, and especially a justified belief, to actually understand why what you believe is true, if it is, you actually need some opposition. You need someone to argue with. And as Mill said, actually, probably sometimes they're going to be right and you're going to be wrong. Sometimes you're both going to have a little bit of the truth, and sometimes you're completely right, but now you gain a new justification and a new understanding for your view when you fearlessly encounter opposition, as Mill said. And when we think about it, even the medieval Catholic Church, which a lot of people would say, look, they're intolerant, they're propounding dogma, even the church had the practice of finding a devil's advocate. So if nobody in the room disagreed, you were supposed to invent a devil's advocate to say, well, look, there's got to be another argument here, and we got to figure out what the other argument is, and we're more likely to get to the truth that way. Okay, so an example of how conformity undermines the search for truth, and specifically conformity with what I call the central dogma, comes in, well, from the discipline of social psychology. It's actually in a lot of disciplines, but the example is the replication crisis, or replication problem. So in the 2010s, a University of Virginia psychologist named Brian Nosek published a big meta-review, and what he found is that more than half of all of the major findings in psychology textbooks, the big studies that were done, couldn't be replicated by independent research teams. In other words, a lot of what students are learning is just not true, or at the very least, we can't show that it's true because when you try to replicate the results, you can't. Especially examples like implicit bias and stereotype threat. You guys have heard these terms many times, I'm sure. They're still repeated by journalists, and yet they're somewhere between completely bunk or they barely replicate with really small results when people try to replicate them. Okay, so why is there a replication crisis? Well, one simple example that's innocuous is that, well, journals don't publish failed attempts to find results because that seems boring, right? You publish really dramatic and exciting results, but if someone says, I tried to find this thing, but it turned out I couldn't find it, yeah, that's not very interesting, so you're less likely to publish it. Fine, that happens in all fields. But I think a big part of the problem is actually political bias And political bias, as I argued earlier, influences who is selected to edit journals, who's selected to review grant proposals, and which faculty are hired and promoted. So this ends up setting the agenda for disciplines, for how they teach, for what kinds of research they do, what's considered worthwhile research, and so on. And of course, there are always going to be agenda setters. I don't want to pretend that politics could somehow ever completely disappear. It's just that when everyone, when, quote, all good people agree on one political dogma, you can see how it's less likely that you're going to get at the truth in that discipline. Okay, so I now want to talk about consequences of conformity with this dogma outside of the academy. So when we think about it, this is true of most countries, whether you're a journalist, a teacher, a judge, any of these professions, you need university credentials to practice your craft, certainly in medicine and law. And when we think about law in particular and focusing on the central dogma and conformity with that dogma, we have a very specific body of legal dogma that has arisen around that since the 1970s. And the idea is what's often called disparate impact interpretations of the law. So disparate impact is the idea that if you have a law that's completely impartially applied, but you get different results, different groups or different individuals end up in very different positions, making more or less money or succeeding in one occupation or another, that's automatic evidence that that law is unjust. Now that seems crazy. Well, I hope it seems crazy on the surface, and yet this is a large body of jurisprudential doctrine in the United States now, this idea of disparate impact. But of course, as Thomas Sowell and many others have pointed out, disparities are the norm, not the exception, in particular disparities between groups, and they go in all kinds of interesting directions. So, for example, Jewish Americans win far more Nobel Prizes per capita than any other group, and it's not even close. Ashkenazi Jews are just completely dominating Nobel Prizes. Asians do especially well on SAT tests, and they're admitted at higher rates to universities, and I mean East Asians. South Asians, namely Indians and Pakistanis, actually make the most money per capita than any group in the United States, doubled the income of white Americans. And blacks completely dominate sports, as you probably know from watching the Olympics or the NBA or the NFL. They comprise about 70% of the National Football League, and I think it's higher than the National Basketball Association. Nevertheless, in 1971, a progressive U.S. Supreme Court ruled that employers couldn't use tests that had a disparate impact on different groups. So even if that test was a good predictor of performance at work, sometimes it might be an IQ test, otherwise it might be a personality test, because different personalities work out well for different jobs. If you're an introvert, maybe you're better suited for software engineering, where you sit in a room and program all day. If you're an extrovert, maybe you're better at family medicine and that sort of thing, where you're talking to people all day and you're really good at talking to people. Well, the Supreme Court banned IQ tests for exactly that reason. They have a disparate impact, and therefore they shouldn't be used. But if taken to its logical conclusion, this reasoning would imply that any test that ended up leading to disparate impacts, leading to the NFL to be 70% black, or family medicine to be 80% women, should also be illegal. And I think that you might see the absurdity in this, although some might agree with it. So this is an example of the central dogma being in some way promulgated on American college campuses, but then ending up in the legal profession. And another example before I close, and I've seen this in recent years, a lot of my students at elite universities like Duke or Penn, they end up working for Facebook at the age of, 20, in an internship, and then by 22, they have a full-time job making $300,000 a year. No, that's not an exaggeration. They really make that kind of money at age 22. Well, they absorbed the central dogma at the elite universities, Stanford and Harvard and Yale, and they end up controlling the algorithms of social media. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of these engage in not only, quote, deplatforming and deleting accounts, they also engage in algorithmic manipulation. So we know from a number of researchers that votes, especially in the American election, many estimate that millions of votes were shifted from one side to another. You can guess which direction that went in. I don't have to tell you, because of algorithmic manipulation, where YouTube artificially promotes certain content and artificially de-elevates other content, apart from deleting accounts and outright censorship. So this is a really dangerous phenomenon, and if you like the way they're censoring now, just flip the results. Imagine if the other party was in power, and I promise you, at some point they will be. A party that you deeply disagree with will be in power, and they will be manipulating you. You should be worried about what's going on American campuses, because it's leaking outside of those campuses, and it's coming to a university near you. Now, I want to end by asking what can be done about the kind of increasing dogma on American campuses and campuses around the world. Well, the first rule of Alcoholics Anonymous, as you probably know, is to admit that there's a problem. I'm a drunk, and I need to figure out what to do about this. I need to put the bottle down. And in a recent study called Academic Freedom in Crisis, the aforementioned Eric Kaufman at Birkbeck College in London showed that younger faculty are much more radical than older faculty, and graduate students are still more radical than younger faculty. Now, because we have these systems of tenure and the equivalent of tenure in the United Kingdom, Canada, and so on, what's going to happen is we're actually moving farther and farther away from viewpoint diversity, and this is going to get locked in through these formal rules and procedures like tenure. So you haven't seen anything yet. Just wait until you see what comes in the next 10 to 15 years. And I want to warn against thinking, look, this can be solved through a simple change of rules. Maybe you get a different president or a different governor in a state, and he'll just like change the rules, or she'll change the rules, and we'll respect free speech and viewpoint diversity, and we're all good. I think there's a real problem with that solution. And the problem is these kinds of formal rules and protections have very little effect, in my view, unless faculty, administrators, and students internalize norms of respect, free speech, viewpoint diversity. If they don't do that, rules can easily be manipulated to achieve political outcomes. And if you doubt that, look at the Soviet Constitution and ask yourself, like, was that a really good or bad constitution? It actually wasn't that bad in many ways. The problem is nobody cared what was in the Constitution. These are words on paper. What really matters is what the true believers want to do with their power. And I'll give you a simple example before I close, and that's a colleague of mine, Amy Wax, at the University of Pennsylvania, a tenured law professor who was denounced by her colleagues for expressing conservative views about immigration. She was then prevented from teaching her first-year class. She still can't teach it. And the dean of the law school, when asked to comment about the controversy, this is 2 or 3 years ago, said, and I quote, "Her presence here makes me angry. But," and I'm quoting, "the only way to get rid of her, a tenured professor, is this process, and it's going to take months." In other words, the dean of the law school at a major Ivy League university, what he wanted to do is figure out, how do I get rid of her as soon as possible because people disagree with her about her political views? He wasn't asking himself, like what's the point of free speech? Or like, is she saying anything that's illegal or that's like deeply and horribly immoral? No. People just disagree with it on the faculty, so I'm going to figure out how to fire her. So again, this shows that without a principled commitment to viewpoint diversity and free speech, I think formal rule changes are really just not going to work. They're not going to do anything. So I want to conclude by saying, look, academic taboos, especially the ones surrounding the Central Dogma, undermine the pursuit of truth in universities. And Richard Feynman, who's shown here, he's a Nobel laureate from Caltech, one of the great physicists of all time. He said that science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. He has a lot of clever quotations. Another one is on this slide. Science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. It's not an algorithm for like spitting out equations and facts. That's not how science works at all. When you hear people saying things like, follow the science, experts agree, studies show, you should dismiss this as obvious moral posturing. That's not how science works at all. It never has. Take it from a Nobel laureate, not from me. So when we think about education, it's the same way. Education doesn't work by conformity and by the delivery of so-called facts from priests in university classrooms. Science, like education, thrives on disagreement and dissent, not on conformity. Thank you.